Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I have the pleasure to talk to you about one of the most important endocrine glands of the entire body. Although it's not fair to say that because each of the glands are important in their own way. But if I were to play favorites, I might make this one most important. It's a little tiny gland, and let's jump right into this conversation. It's a little tiny gland at the base of your brain, and it's called the pituitary. That's right, the pituitary gland is our discussion today. Out of all the glands that make up the endocrine system, pituitary gland is going to be really important. And so here's the actual location right here, pituitary. It's on this little stalk right there, right below or inferior to the hypothalamus. And that's going to be important because, as we're going to see in this video, the hypothalamus in part controls the secretion or not secretion of pituitary hormones. And so what's fascinating about the pituitary gland, though it's the size of about a pea, so a green pea, and it sits on this stalk right here, we can actually break it up into two lobes, and they're rather distinctive. One of them is towards the front or anterior. So this is the front of your head, and this is the posterior, so anterior, posterior. So there's a anterior lobe and a posterior lobe, and so there's distinctive hormones that are coming from each of those lobes, so that's important. So something to consider. So here's a picture that might get your attention. This is a cadaver that's been sliced in half, and you can see the brain right here. I thought you'd enjoy this because you can literally see the pituitary gland right there, which is right below the hypothalamus. And the pituitary gland sits right above these two sinuses right here. This is the ethmoid sinus and the sphygmoid sinus right there. So that's its actual location, the pituitary. Now, when I say it's an endocrine gland, just for everyone to be on the same page, what I mean by that is that it's a gland that's capable of secreting, and what it's secreting are hormones, which are chemical messengers that are specific to target cells, and those secretions, those hormones, are traveling in the bloodstream. So this is what we're talking about. So let's discuss what I was mentioning earlier about that hypothalamus. That hypothalamus, which is sitting superior to the pituitary gland, produces some releasing hormones. So these hormones will travel in the bloodstream to the pituitary gland, causing them directly, will cause the anterior, in particular pituitary gland, to secrete its hormones. So those are releasing hormones from the pituitary, from the hypothalamus. So let's take a look at that. So here we are in the hypothalamus, and here's your typical neuron, although there are no typical ones, but it's a neurosecretory cell. So it's capable of secreting hormones. So those releasing hormones, as they're generally described, travel into the bloodstream. They don't have to go very far, and they travel down these blood vessels down to the anterior lobe. So this is going to be the anterior lobe. So it's a little switcheroo from the picture I showed you before. So this person would be facing in that direction. So this is the front, the anterior lobe. Now notice the blood circulates through all these cells, and these cells are the glands. A gland is no more a collection of cells that are specialized for secretion. And in this case, it's the anterior pituitary gland. And so these are the cells that are going to be secreting, and what they're actually secreting are these little tiny green dots, which are the hormones, and that's going to be diffusing into the bloodstream and being carried away through the rest of the body, wherever they're going. So the blue dots are the releasing hormones from the hypothalamus, and then the anterior pituitary gland is releasing the various hormones. And so our discussion today is going to be about what are those hormones? Like, what are the hormones of the anterior lobe? Now, take a look at the pituitary, the posterior lobe. It's kind of interesting to draw your attention to that. Notice here the secretory nerves of the hypothalamus actually extend from the hypothalamus, this is the axon right here, extend all the way down the connecting stalk into the posterior lobe. The truth is that the posterior pituitary gland is merely just the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus. because, in fact, they produce two hormones, something called ADH and oxytocin. We'll talk about that. But those go directly from the posterior region right into the blood. And so there's the posterior pituitary hormones, and then here's the anterior pituitary hormones. So the anterior is a little bit larger as well. And so let's first discuss, now we switched off, so now we're looking this way. This is the anterior lobe. And so here are the releasing hormones, and then what are these hormones? Now each of these are different. These little blue dots are anterior pituitary gland hormones. What are those blue dots? And so these are the cast of characters. Now, just a caution, if you don't mind, don't become overwhelmed by the magnitude of this, or don't be discouraged by acronyms. Acronyms are helpful, especially when the words are very long. We can shorten them, but also it's all about familiarity. And the more that you're comfortable with, the more you work with each of these hormones, the more that you spend time studying them, it all becomes very straightforward. But I'm going to come very strong and just sort of name them. So it might be intimidating in terms of like remembering through your memorization, but it's not about memorization. It's about just understanding and enjoying these hormones. And so one of the first hormones, just going from left to right, that the pituitary, anterior pituitary, produces is pretty famous. It's growth hormone. And since we're discussing human, I don't have to, but I will. I can put an H in front of it. So HGH, human growth hormone. There's other hormones that people are like bovine growth hormone is often used in development of cattle to make sure that they're growing larger for a variety of reasons, for purposes to produce large quantities of meat. But in this case, human growth hormone, and its target is that of the bones. It causes bones to grow, and I think that makes perfectly good sense. And so this growth hormone sort of tails off as we get a little bit older, but it's certainly prominent in our adolescence. And then this one right here, prolactin. Prolactin is a hormone that is particularly important in females, and it stimulates the mammary glands to actually produce milk, which the main sugar of milk is lactose, so thus the name prolactin. These two hormones right here, follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, or luteinizing hormone, or LH, are considered to be gonadotropin. Gonadotropin meaning going toward, tropism meaning toward something. Gonads are reproductive organs. So gonadotropin hormones, because their target are testes and ovaries. And so this will come up in conversation in detail when we look at the systems of reproduction in both male and female. But briefly, follicle stimulating hormone causes the follicle in the ovary to mature once a month, and it prepares it to ovulate on what is the second week, generally, of a 4-week reproductive cycle in the ovary. And this hormone, luteinizing hormone, is particularly important because it spikes up at around day 14, which initiates ovulation, which results in a group of cells in the ovary that remain. The egg is released during ovulation, but the group of cells that remain are called the corpus luteum. And so that's why it gets that name, luteinizing hormone. It's a yellowish structure that produces, it's glandular, and it produces estrogen and progesterone, the corpus luteum. Thyroid stimulating hormone, as the name might imply, stimulates the thyroid to start secreting. So there you have it. So the thyroid gland is under control of the pituitary. Same with the testes and ovaries. So what they're doing is actually in control from the brain. It's fascinating. This one's a cool one, ACTH, or adrenal corticotropin hormone. So the cortex of the adrenal gland is the outer coating of the adrenal gland. We'll be studying that a little bit later in a separate video. But this is a hormone that travels to just the adrenal cortex. So it's adrenal corticotropin hormone. That's what that stands for. And then melanocyte stimulating hormone, or MSH, stimulates the melanocytes to produce endorphins. You may have heard of this chemical before. This is can be a hormone, and it is involved in detonating pain receptors, and so it has sort of a euphoric type of sensation, endorphins. All right, and so what's interesting is I'm going to just go through some of these hormones a little bit more detailed and describe to you what they are chemically and refresh you perhaps on what they do. So human growth hormone is a protein. Now, remember, hormones could be classified either as being a steroid or a non-steroid. So this would be a non-steroid since it's a protein. What does it do? It stimulates growth, both muscular and also bone development as well. So it causes these cells to divide and to manifest and proliferate. And it also affects the metabolism responsible for that growth. So as it turns out, there's two types of disorders that can come from human growth hormone. If you look at it this way, in terms of everybody needs just the right amount. So if you have excessive amount of growth hormone, that could be problematic. If you have too little of growth hormone, that could be a problem as well. And so what we call some of these things are different names. We have different syndromes, like gigantism. You might imagine that is excessive growth hormone. So that's hyper. There's a lot of it. And so here's an individual that's like sort of say abnormal, but I'm not sure what normal is, but certainly a phenotype that is certainly on the high end, pun intended. And then here's a woman who has excessive gigantism, so an abundance of growth hormone. Now, the contrast to that is hypopituitary dwarfism, meaning that you have a low amount, and usually this occurs genetically, and it can be treated a little bit with growth hormone, but overall, there's not much that can be done about this hypopituitary. So it's a human growth hormone deficiency. So prolactin, I mentioned before, influences the mammary glands, and it's a protein. It's produced by all of these are anterior pituitary gland hormones. It stimulates milk production. So this is particularly important during pregnancy, and also particularly important after the baby is born, so for lactation. And it helps the secretion of milk. And so these gonadotropin hormones, and I mentioned this before, like going toward the gonads. So this is going toward the gonads. Gonads meaning ovary and testes. So these are glycoproteins, again, sugary proteins, not non-steroid. Follicle stimulating hormone, also in addition to maturing the egg during the ovarian cycle, it also influences the production of the egg itself, causing the follicle to mature. More about that later. And again, luteinizing hormone stimulates the ovaries and testes. Now, you might be wondering, I mentioned follicle stimulating hormone in the ovary and luteinizing hormone in the ovary. These similar hormones are present in male, but they do different things. Like, for example, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone could also be called interstitial cell stimulating hormone, which causes the testes to start producing sperm, for example, spermatogenesis at puberty. This is particularly important, and also can stimulate the testes, especially the cells in between these tubes called seminiferous tubules. They're called interstitial cells, to stimulate testosterone. And so more about that later. Those are a little complicated, but I'll just say that these are hormones that are produced by the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and they go to the gonads. We have thyroid stimulating hormone, which again is a glycoprotein, and it stimulates the thyroid gland to produce its thyroid hormones. And adrenocorticotropin hormone, meaning it's going toward the adrenal cortex, and it's a peptide. Peptide is a little different than a protein because it's very small, and so if you recall, proteins are made up of polypeptides, many of them. So this is a very tiny hormone, and it stimulates the cortex to secrete its hormones, which are glucocorticoids. In other words, hormones that influence glucose metabolism. Melanocyte stimulating hormone plays a role, not only in melanocyte production, but it also plays a role in fat metabolism, as it turns out. This is fairly recent discovery, and it's also a peptide, MSH. And then endorphins are small peptides, and what's interesting about these endorphins is that they're highly studied because to inhibit pain is very important to us in terms of medicine. It's unfortunate that people occur and have pain, and sometimes chronic pain, and such medications or drugs, depending on how you want to consider them, are heroin and all this opiate drugs are sort of mimics or isomers of these endorphin peptides. And so they function similarly, and the body responds to them in the same way. It's kind of interesting. So the posterior lobe, we spent so much time talking about all those hormones of the anterior lobe. What about the posterior lobe? What is it secreting? Remember what I said earlier? Technically, it's not secreting anything itself, but it's actually just the place in which the hormone takes off, because the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus are truly the ones that are making these two posterior pituitary hormones, and those are antidiuretic hormone, ADH. And antidiuretic means that the kidneys, which is the target, are trying to retain water. They're trying to hold on to water. So the brain would be producing this under really, really warm conditions where you're trying to conserve your water, not urinate it out. And then oxytocin is a hormone that's produced that influences the mammary glands and urinary. I'm thinking urinary because of the kidneys over here, but these are your uterus. So the uterus muscles during labor. So when a woman is giving birth, the uterus is contracting, which is called labor, because she's laboring to squeeze out the baby. And so this hormone, oxytocin, delivers the important message to the uterine muscles to start to contract. And we've also studied this hormone rather closely, and we've been able to create a synthetic, pretty cheap analog or an isomer of it called protocin. And so oftentimes females will get Pitocin drips, or just a prot, as it's sometimes called clinically, a prot drip, to help to initiate labor if it's not going as planned, or if it's taking too long. And what's interesting about oxytocin, sorry for going off on this, is that it's regulated by a positive feedback, because the muscles that are contracting send nerve impulses to the pituitary to produce more oxytocin, and then more oxytocin produces even more muscle contraction. And then when the uterus contracts even harder and in shorter durations between the contractions, that's going to cause even more oxytocin. And so it's a positive feedback, and you're like, well, it's never going to end. It ends when the baby is delivered. And so there you have it. So these are the hormones that are produced by the pituitary, the posterior pituitary, and those are oxytocin. Toke, that word right there literally means birth. So it's a birthing hormone. So it causes contractions of the uterus and the mammary. And why mammary glands? There's muscles in between the glands which help to cause the milk to be released to the outside through the nipple. And so antidiuretic hormone is something that promotes the retention of water in the kidneys. It's really cool. Fairly recent discovery in those tubules in the kidney. What's interesting is this hormone is capable of causing those cells to produce proteins in the cell membrane of the kidney that reabsorb water. And we've always thought that water was small enough to just simply diffuse across the cell membrane via osmosis. But we've discovered most recently, I'd say most recently in the last 2 decades, that the amount of water reabsorption from the kidney is so tremendous that there must be some kind of protein channel involved. And so we discovered these channels called aquaporons that actually help to facilitate the reabsorption of water back into the bloodstream when you're becoming dehydrated. And it's this hormone, ADH, which causes the cell to produce those aquaporons. Pretty awesome. And so this is a chart. Don't become overwhelmed, but this is what we've looked at so far. We've looked at the hypothalamus produces releasing hormones which influence the pituitary gland. We said that the posterior lobe, which is what we just studied, produces these two hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. And then the anterior lobe does all of these ones right here, which is growth hormone, prolactin, FSH, LH, TSH, and adrenal corticotropin hormone. And so if you're interested, we'll be watching, if you're interested in watching, I'm going to create some more videos about thyroid hormones and parathyroid hormones. Also a video on the pancreas itself and on the adrenal glands, all very important. And then when we get into gonads, I'll discuss those in detail in a separate video on the reproductive system. And I mentioned pineal gland in a previous video on introduction to the endocrine system, and that produces melatonin, which is responsible for our circadian meaning like around a day cycling, light and dark cycling, helping us keep our sleep regulated. And then the thymus produces thymosin, and I'll bring that up when we discuss the immune system, because that particular hormone is important in stimulating T lymphocytes. All right, so I hope that was helpful, and I hope you enjoyed our conversation today about the pituitary gland. It's small, but it packs a wallop. So thanks for watching.